golden clouds parted as the winged demons carried the traveler toward the high mountain peak, revealing the massive stone walls of the City of the Sun. Anor Londo sat above the world, a place of white marble and gold that seemed untouched by the rot of the undead berg or the filth of the depths. The arrival at the grand balcony brought a sudden and intense silence, broken only by the low whistle of the mountain wind through the tall spires. This city was the heart of the kingdom of the lords, a massive construction built to reflect the absolute glory of the Age of Fire and the power of the First Lord, Gwyn. The spirit of the warrior was a cold and steady flame, focused on the site of the great cathedral where the gods had once looked down upon the human world with a quiet majesty. The history of the city was rooted in the concept of divine propaganda. During the peak of the Age of Fire, the lords built these massive halls and oversized doorways to create an environment where the scale of the architecture would make any visitor feel small and insignificant. It was a physical manifestation of the hierarchy between the gods and the men, a way to show that the reign of the sun was as eternal as the stone itself. The traveler moved through the giant stairs where the air carried the scent of the dry grit and the metallic tang of a world that was frozen in a perpetual afternoon. They encountered the statues of the Silver Knights in the heart of the stone hallways, their presence a steady vibration of the absolute and cold duty to a crown that had long since departed the physical realm. The investigation into the legend of the sun led the traveler toward the first great courtyard, where the scale of the deception began to reveal itself. The city was not merely a home for the royal family, but a temple of the perception, where the very light was a tool of the control. The atmosphere was a mixture of the gold light and the deep shadows of the pillars that made the air feel heavy against the skin. They found that the city used the beauty of the marble to hide the reality of the fatting flame, creating a sanctuary that was meant to keep the undead in a state of constant hope. Every hallway was designed as a piece of the grand theater, meant to guide the chosen toward the eventual sacrifice of their own soul to keep the golden illusion alive for just a few more years. The undead moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air whistling as they faced the sentinels in the heart of the golden courtyard. These massive guardians in brass armor and holding giant shields moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as the halberds cut through the space with a rhythmic and sharp sound. The struggle for the entrance was a roar of the movement, and the rhythmic pulse of the two spirits fighting for the right to step into the inner sanctum. Every strike of the brass was a thud that shook the foundations of the terrace, filling the air with the sparks and the iron scent of the fresh blood. They stood in the quiet of the square after the giants were pushed back, their breath a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the palace. They found the strength to move forward, the air carrying the scent of the mountain pine and the old iron. The path to the high rafters moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air turning into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They reached the first bonfire of the city, where the firekeeper sat in her brass armor, her presence a steady vibration of the ancient memories of the fire. The traveler felt the pulse of the power moving through their mind, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the knowledge of the way the gods had bound the humans to the service of the sun. They looked toward the painting gallery, where the air felt weighted with the presence of the secret guardians and the heavy silence of the empty thrones. They knew that the secrets of the gods were hidden in the scale of the buildings, and the air of the city was full of the strength of the hidden ways. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was weaving the threads of a new world. They saw the great wings of the demons shrinking in the distance. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the lower bridge, and the air of the terrace grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the high rafters of the painting room. The click of the metal on the floor was the only sound in the golden light as the traveler prepared to face the guardians of the canvas. High above the cathedral floor, the narrow rafters felt like a tightrope between the divine and the forgotten. The air here was thin, carrying the scent of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of cold marble. As the traveler balanced on these stone ribs, the silence was broken only by the soft, rhythmic padding of the painting guardians. Clad in bone-white robes, these warriors moved with a haunting grace, their curved scimitars catching the golden light that spilled through the high windows. These were not just guards. They were the sworn protectors of a secret that the gods deemed too dangerous for the physical world, the massive canvas that sat at the end of the hall. The history of the painted world of Ariames is a testament to the gods' fear of the unknown. While Anor Londo served as a beacon of light, the painting was its shadow, a cold, snow-swept exile for anything that threatened the stability of the Age of Fire. It was the ultimate containment for the life-hunted Priscilla and the dark power of the occult, which possessed the strength to slay the lords themselves. By trapping these threats within a masterpiece of art, the gods maintained their propaganda of a perfect, untouchable kingdom. The atmosphere in the gallery was a clash between the radiant glory of the architecture and the chilling realization that this city was built upon a foundation of absolute exclusion. The traveler's journey across the ceiling was a test of focus. Reaching the center of the hall, they found the great iron chandelier held by a heavy, rusted chain. With a single strike, the chain snapped, sending the massive light fixture crashing to the marble floor below. This act of destruction revealed the great magic weapon sorcery, a hint that even the tools of the gods were sometimes discarded or hidden away in the rafters. The spirit of the warrior burned like a steady flame. As they considered how many scholars and seekers had been lost in these heights, trying to find a way into the world behind the glass. Descending from the rafters brought the traveler to the massive mechanism of the central tower. Grasping the giant iron lever, they felt the vibration of ancient gears grinding against the stone. The entire bridge began to rotate, a feat of engineering that echoed through the mountain air like a low growl of thunder. This tower was the axis of the city, connecting the different levels of the propaganda machine. As the bridge locked into place, the path to the Dark Moon tomb was revealed, a place where the sun's light failed to reach. And the youngest son of the king waited in the gloom. The traveler moved toward the dark stairs, where the air grew damp and smelled of cooling rain. They looked back at the rotating bridge, seeing it as a symbol of the gods' control over the very movement of the city. Beneath the gilded surface of the cathedral, the secrets of Gwyndolin and the moon were waiting to be unraveled. The metal of the warrior's armor clicked against the stone with a grounding force, a sharp contrast to the ethereal silence of the painting they had just passed. The time for balancing on rafters was over. The time for facing the archers of the high wall had begun. Leaving the rotating tower behind, the traveler faced the most daunting climb in the city of the gods. The massive flying buttresses rose like the skeletal ribs of a giant, arching toward the high balconies of the main cathedral. These narrow stone paths were exposed to the biting mountain winds that whipped through the valley, carrying the scent of dry grit and the distant chill of the peaks. The silence here was predatory. It was a place designed to break the will of any interloper long before they ever reached the royal chambers. This was the outer ring of the gods' defense, a physical manifestation of their absolute authority over the vertical space of the world. Standing atop the distant ledges were the Silver Knights, the elite guard of the sun. Unlike the Black Knights who wandered the world as charred husks after the linking of the fire, these warriors remained in Anor Londo, their armor shining as if the age of fire had never begun to dim. Their presence was a crucial part of the city's propaganda. They were the living proof that the king's army was still vast, disciplined, and untouchable. They stood motionless as statues until the traveler stepped onto the narrowest part of the ledge. And then the air was suddenly shattered by the rhythmic, whistling scream of the dragon slayer great bows. The arrows launched by these knights were the size of spears, designed to knock a man off his feet and send him plummeting into the abyss below. The sound of the shafts striking the stone was a sharp, explosive crack that echoed across the cathedral walls. This was a battle of millimeters and timing. The traveler moved with a relentless energy, shielding themselves behind the stone pillars as the massive projectiles splintered the marble nearby. The atmosphere was a suffocating pressure of precision. The knights didn't need to move, for their aim was a product of centuries of training in the service of the lords. They were the gatekeepers of the inner sanctum, meant to ensure that only those with the strength of a lord could ever hope to see the face of the princess. As the traveler reached the final ledge, the archers cast aside their bows and drew their silver straight swords. The clatter of steel on stone was a sudden and violent roar in the quiet of the heights. These knights fought with a cold, rhythmic grace that reflected the high culture of the city they guarded. Every parry and thrust was a reminder of the martial tradition that had once conquered the ancient dragons. The struggle was not just against the soldiers, but against the weight of the history they represented. The traveler felt the pulse of the city's power in every blow, a steady vibration of the ancient pride that refused to admit the sun was setting. By overcoming the archers, the warrior gained access to the inner balconies, where the air was stagnant and smelled of old iron and cold earth. Inside, the cathedral revealed its true nature as a sprawling museum of the royal family's past. The hallways were lined with the armor of the knights who had served the four sisters and the sons of the king. Yet, the rooms were mostly empty. The grand banquets and war councils were now just memories trapped in the stone. The traveler moved through the bedrooms and the trophy halls, noticing how the furniture was built for the stature of giants, making the presence of any human feel like a transgression. Deep within these chambers, they discovered the hidden storage of Havel the Rock. Behind an illusory fireplace, the air was thick with the scent of old soot and the ozone of powerful magic. They found the heavy dragon-tooth weapon and the stone armor of the legendary bishop, who had once been the closest friend of Lord Gwyn. The lore hidden in this dark basement suggested a fracture in the propaganda of the city. Havel, a hero of the Dragon Wars, had apparently turned against the gods, or perhaps against the influence of Seath, the Scaleless. His imprisonment or hiding of his gear here was a silent testament to the civil unrest that had bubbled beneath the golden surface of the palace. The path eventually led to a massive open hall where a giant sat among the crates and the anvil. The giant blacksmith was a figure of quiet, rhythmic labor, his hammer hitting the glowing metal with a grounding force that seemed to anchor the entire city. While the gods had fled, the giants remained to perform the tasks that kept the palace functional. The smith was a keeper of the crystalline embers, capable of forging the weapons that could harness the lightning of the sky. His air was one of a simple, focused devotion, a sharp contrast to the complex deceptions of the lords who had employed him. The traveler stood by the forge for a moment, the heat of the coal warming their chilled limbs. They looked toward the main hall, where the statues of the guardians loomed in the distance. The climb across the buttresses had stripped away the initial awe of the city, replacing it with a cold understanding of the violence required to maintain such beauty. The metal of their armor clicked against the floor as they prepared to unlock the front gates. The stage was being set for the final confrontation in the heart of the cathedral, and the weight of the Lord Vessel felt heavier with every step toward the golden fog. The journey through the Silver Guard had proven that the city's strength was not just an illusion, even if its purpose was a lie. With the shortcut opened and the blacksmith found, the traveler turned their gaze toward the grand elevators. The legend of the dragon slayer and the executioner was the only thing that stood between the pilgrim and the princess, and the air of the cathedral was full of the strength of the coming transition. The descent into the great hall of the cathedral felt like walking into a massive, gilded tomb. The scale of the room was staggering. The ceiling reached so high into the rafters that the light from the upper windows seemed to lose its strength before it ever touched the marble floor. The air here was still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of incense that had long ago burned to ash, and the cold, metallic tang of the brass armor worn by the sentinels. These giants stood like living statues at the base of the stairs, their great shields blocking the path to the inner sanctum. They were the silent enforcers of the gods' will, maintaining the illusion of a bustling, defended palace, even as the hallways remained empty of any true life. As the traveler moved toward the grand fog gate, the lore of the city's defenders began to take shape in the silence. This hall was the site of the ultimate trial for any undead who sought the Lord Vessel. It was a place of high drama and lethal consequences, designed as the final chapter of the gods' propaganda. To reach the princess, one had to overcome the legendary duo, Dragon Slayer Ornstein and Executioner Smough. They represented the two sides of the Anor Londo image, the noble, lightning-wreathed hero of the Dragon Wars, and the brutal, terrifying force of the state's darker necessities. Ornstein, the captain of the 4 Knights of Gwyn, was the golden standard of the Age of Fire. His armor was crafted in the likeness of a lion, and his spear was said to have split the scales of the ancient dragons with the power of the sun itself. In the propaganda of the city, he was the shining protector, a symbol of grace and divine favor. But his partner, Smough, told a different story. Though he possessed strength that rivaled the giants, Smough was never granted the rank of knight because of his gruesome habit of grinding the bones of his victims into his meals. The gods kept him as a guardian, a necessary monster hidden behind a golden mask, showing that the glory of Anor Londo was always underpinned by a foundation of absolute, crushing violence. Entering the arena, the traveler felt the sudden shift in the air as the two guardians moved to strike. The battle was a chaotic symphony of speed and power. Ornstein moved like a bolt of lightning, his spear whistling through the air with a rhythmic precision that forced the traveler to react with every ounce of their focus. Meanwhile, Smough's massive hammer shattered the marble pillars with a heavy, grounding thud that shook the very foundations of the cathedral. This was the god's final exam. It was not enough to be strong. One had to be able to endure the combined weight of the city's history and its hunger. The struggle for the hall was more than a physical fight. It was a clash of spirits. As the traveler dodged the sweeping strikes of the hammer and the sudden lunges of the spear, they saw the strange bond between the two guardians. When one fell, the other did not mourn, but instead absorbed the power of their comrade, a brutal and sharp transition that turned the survivor into a true titan of the flame. This mechanic was a piece of the grand theater, meant to show the resilience of the divine order, that the power of the lords could never truly be extinguished, only transferred and intensified. When the final blow was struck and the golden guardians dissolved into dust, the silence that returned to the hall was absolute. The traveler stood in the center of the nave, their breath a steady rhythm in the quiet. The defeat of Ornstein and Smough was the shattering of the city's physical shield. What remained was the heart of the palace, the royal elevator that led to the chambers of the princess. The air in the hall seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight of the legendary guards replaced by a sudden, expectant stillness. Walking toward the elevators, the traveler noticed the empty pedestals where statues of the gods once stood. The absence of the firstborn son was a glaring hole in the family history, a reminder that the propaganda of the sun was built as much on what was deleted as what was displayed. They ascended the final lift, the mechanism humming with a soft, ancient energy. They were leaving the world of the soldiers and the executioners behind, moving into the presence of the divine itself. The path ahead was bathed in a warm, artificial glow that suggested a bounty that the rest of the world had forgotten. The traveler checked the grip on their weapon, the metal clicking with a grounding force as they prepared to meet Guinevere, the princess of sunlight. They were at the threshold of the city's greatest lie, and the air of the upper chamber was full of the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of a reward that had been thousands of years in the making. The massive double doors at the top of the cathedral groaned open, revealing a chamber that felt entirely disconnected from the cold, stone reality of the city. The air here was a heavy, sweet perfume of blooming lilies and warm honey, carrying a radiant warmth that seemed to push back the very idea of the undead curse. In the center of the room, reclining upon a gargantuan silk couch, was Guinevere, the princess of sunlight. Her scale was immense, her presence filling the hall with a soft, golden glow that made the traveler feel like a speck of dust caught in a sunbeam. Her voice, when she spoke, was a rhythmic and gentle vibration that promised an end to the long pilgrimage and a beginning to a new age of fire. The lore of Guinevere is the crown jewel of the Anor Londo propaganda. To the people of Lordran, she was the symbol of bounty, fertility, and the nurturing light of the sun. Her image was used by the gods to provide a sense of hope and comfort to a world that was slowly falling into shadow. By presenting a goddess of such overwhelming beauty and kindness, the lords ensured that the chosen undead would feel a sense of divine purpose, rather than the grim reality of being used as fuel. The atmosphere of the chamber was designed to be a sanctuary, a place where the struggle of the climb was forgotten, in the presence of a motherly grace that felt absolute and eternal. As the traveler knelt, the princess bestowed upon them the Lord Vessel, a massive bronze basin of ancient and heavy craftsmanship. This vessel was more than a trophy. It was the only artifact capable of containing the powerful souls of the lords who had stayed behind in the world. The act of receiving it was a piece of grand theater, a rhythmic and sharp transition from being a mere wanderer to becoming the chosen undead. Who would succeed Lord Gwyn? The spirit of the warrior was a cold flame as they felt the weight of the metal in their hands, realizing that this entire city, the traps, the knights, and the guardians, had been a filter designed to find a soul strong enough to carry this burden. However, beneath the warmth of the princess's gaze lay the city's most profound deception. The lore suggests that the real Guinevere fled Anor Londo long ago to marry the flame god Flan, leaving her home as it began to wither. The figure before the traveler was nothing more than a massive, complex illusion, a projection sustained by the magical will of her brother, Gwyndolin. The sun that bathed the room in light was not the true sun of the world, but a controlled and rhythmic emission of sorcery. This was the ultimate lie. The gods were asking for a sacrifice to save a kingdom that they had already abandoned. The princess was the bait, and the Lord Vessel was the hook. The traveler stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the golden city with the vessel held tight. The air outside the chamber felt different now. The scent of the flowers lingered, but the metallic tang of the truth was beginning to bleed through. They looked down toward the rotating bridge and the dark moon tomb hidden in the base of the tower. They knew that the secrets of the propaganda were not just in the heights of the cathedral, but in the shadows where the illusionist resided. The metal of their armor clicked against the stone as they prepared to descend, the weight of the bronze serving as a constant reminder of the monumental task ahead. The story was moving toward its most pivotal revelation. The traveler had reached the peak of the mountain and met the goddess of the sun, but the cracks in the golden mask were becoming impossible to ignore. They entered the heart of the descent, the air of the royal chamber growing distant as they prepared to investigate the one god who remained in the city, the dark sun, who ruled from the twilight of the tomb. The light of the Lord Vessel was a steady and heavy rhythm in their mind, a guide that would eventually lead them to the heart of the primordial dark. The descent into the lowest levels of the city felt like a slow retreat from a dream. Leaving the sun-drenched chambers of the princess, the traveler returned to the rotating tower and moved the massive gears until the bridge sank to the very base of the cathedral. Here, the air was a thick and stagnant pressure that smelled of damp marble and the cold, waxy scent of funerary lilies. This was the Dark Moon Tomb, a place where the golden propaganda of the upper city finally gave way to a somber, secret reality. The sound of the mountain wind was muffled here, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming of a magical veil that separated the public glory of the gods from the private shame of the royal family. The history of Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun, is the most carefully guarded secret in the lore of Anor Londo. As the youngest son of Lord Gwyn, Gwyndolin was born with a strong affinity for the moon rather than the sun, a trait that the lords considered a deep frailty. Because of his appearance, most notably the serpents that grew where his legs should be, he was raised as a daughter and hidden away from the sight of the world. This abandonment turned him into the silent director of the city's grand play. He was the one who sustained the illusion of his sister Guinevere and the perpetual sunlight, a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute duty to a father who had never truly accepted him. As the traveler knelt before the great rug at the end of the hall, the voice of the god echoed through the stone, not with the booming authority of Gwyn, but with a soft, multi-layered resonance. Gwyndolin ruled the blades of the Dark Moon, a covenant of assassins who served as the invisible hand of the law. While the Silver Knights provided the public face of order, the Dark Moon blades hunted the sinners who dared to threaten the illusions of the gods. The atmosphere of the tomb was a suffocating pressure of absolute and cold justice, a reminder that the beauty of the city was protected by a god who considered himself a monster. The investigation into the lore of the moon led the traveler to step through the fog, breaking the sacred vow of the tomb. The struggle that followed was a chaotic dance of teleporting shadows and flurries of magical arrows. Gwyndolin did not fight with the heavy steel of a warrior, but with the deceptive sorceries of a master of the mind. The hallway seemed to stretch into infinity, an endless corridor of white marble that reflected the gods' own sense of isolation and eternal waiting. Every strike of the traveler's blade against the magical barrier was a thud that shook the foundations of the silence, filling the air with the sparks and the sharp ozone of the moon's power. By reaching the inner sanctum, the warrior found the empty chests and the remnants of the royal family's private mourning. The lore of the tomb revealed a tragic truth. Gwyndolin was the only god who stayed. While his brothers and sisters fled the fatting flame to find new kingdoms, the rejected son remained to guard his father's empty coffin and maintain the golden lie for a world that didn't even know his name. He was the ultimate servant of the propaganda, a figure of profound loyalty who used his brilliance to hide the fact that he was the last light in a dying city. The traveler stood in the quiet of the tomb after the confrontation, the air carrying the scent of mountain pine and the cold earth. The realization of Gwyndolin's role changed everything. The chosen path was not a divine calling, but a script written by a hidden god in a basement. The metal of the warrior's armor clicked against the floor as they prepared to return to the surface, the weight of the Lord vessel feeling like a heavy anchor. They were no longer a mere pilgrim. They were the one who had seen behind the curtain of the god's greatest theater. The path now led back to the main hall, where the traveler faced a choice that would determine the fate of the city's image. They had the power to uphold the lie or to shatter it forever. The air of the cathedral was full of the strength of the coming transition, and the spirit of the warrior was a cold flame as they looked toward the high windows. The time for secrets was ending, and the true face of the world was waiting to be revealed in the twilight. The golden light of the upper cathedral felt different now, like a thick layer of paint hiding a rotted wooden beam. The traveler stood before the image of the princess, the lord vessel heavy in their hands, and felt the unnatural warmth of the room pressing against their skin. The scent of blooming lilies was overwhelming, a rhythmic and suffocating sweetness that seemed to demand blind obedience. With a single, sharp movement, the warrior raised their weapon and struck the figure on the couch. The air did not fill with the sound of a struggle, but with the high-pitched, crystalline shriek of a shattered spell. The transition was violent and absolute. In an instant, the massive form of Guinevere dissolved into golden sparkles, and the radiant sun that had bathed the city for centuries simply vanished. The sky turned a bruised, deep purple, and a freezing mountain chill rushed through the halls, carrying the scent of ancient dust and the sharp ozone of a dead world. This was the birth of dark Anor Londo, the moment the propaganda of the gods finally crumbled to reveal the graveyard beneath. The majority of the knights and the sentinels, who had been nothing but shells of light maintained by Gwyndolin's will, disappeared into the shadows, leaving the city hollow and echoing. The lore of the Dark City is a study in the terror of the lords. They were so frightened of the coming age of humanity, the Age of Dark, that they used every scrap of their remaining divinity to craft a lie that would last long after they had fled. The atmosphere of the Twilight City was a heavy pressure of absolute abandonment, where every footstep on the marble echoed with a sharp, lonely finality. The traveler moved through the empty halls, realizing that the glory they had seen before was merely a mask worn by a corpse. The empty pedestals of the gods stood like accusing fingers in the gloom, marking the spots where the family of Gwyn had once stood before they abandoned their home to the hollows. The base of the tower, the Lady of the Darkling, the firekeeper of the first bonfire, stood waiting. Her brass armor, which had once gleamed like gold, was now a dull, cold metal that reflected the bruised light of the moon. She was a blade of the dark moon, and in her eyes, the traveler had committed the ultimate sin. They had killed the light. The struggle that followed was a roar of movement in the silent square, a rhythmic and sharp duel between the one who clung to the old laws and the one who had seen the truth. Every strike of her mace was a heavy thud that shook the foundations of the belief, a desperate attempt to protect a fire that no longer had a reason to burn. The investigation into the darkened streets revealed the true scale of the desertion. Without the sun to hide the cracks, the city looked weary and ancient. The traveler found that the only residents left were the bitter remnants of the guard and the vengeful spirits summoned by Gwyndolin to punish the breaker of the illusion. This was the reality of the divine propaganda. It was a cage of gold that only looked like a palace when the light was hitting it at the right angle. The spirit of the warrior was a cold flame as they looked up at the dark spires, feeling the weight of the mountain wind as it carried away the last lingering scent of the princess's perfume. Story moved with a steady rhythm as the traveler returned to the great cathedral, their mind focused on the empty space where the statue of the firstborn son should have been. In the dark, the redacted history of the family felt even more prominent. The gods had not only lied about the present, they had scrubbed the past to ensure their image remained perfect. They had cast out their own kin for befriending the dragons, showing that the lords valued the narrative of the war more than the bonds of their own blood. The air of the cathedral was now a thin, pressurized weight that smelled of cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They stood in the center of the dark nave, the lord vessel glowing with a faint, internal heat that provided the only light in the room. The path to the kiln was now clear, but the price of the journey was the total destruction of the gods' greatest work. The traveler moved with the cold energy of the winter, their metal clicking against the floor as they prepared to leave the city behind. The propaganda of the sun had been shattered, and the age of the dark was no longer a distant threat, but a cold reality that was already beginning to settle over the marble walls. The warrior checked the grip on their weapon, the sound a grounding force in the heavy silence. They turned their back on the empty thrones and the dark sky, moving toward the archives where the final secrets of the dragon betrayal were hidden. The air was full of the strength of the coming transition, and the world was finally quiet enough for the truth to be heard. The golden fog gate that had once blocked the way to the mountainside finally dissolved, granting access to the massive stone ramparts leading away from the cathedral. The air here was no longer filled with the heavy perfume of the princess, but with a biting mountain chill and the sharp ozone of a brewing storm. The traveler moved toward the grand entrance of the Duke's archives, a pair of ivory towers that pierced the sky like the horns of a dragon. The sound of the wind was a constant whistle through the high battlements, carrying the scent of old paper, cold stone, and the metallic tang of blue crystal magic. This was the domain of Seath the Scaleless, the grandfather of sorcery and the ultimate beneficiary of the gods' propaganda. The history of Seath is a tale of a betrayal that defined an age. Born without the stone scales of the ancient dragons, he was an outcast among his own kind, a creature of envy and bitterness. During the Great War, he sold the secret of the dragons, immortality, their scales, to Lord Gwyn, ensuring the extinction of his race in exchange for a dukedom and a fragment of a great soul. To the world outside, the propaganda of the lords painted Seath as a noble ally, a scholar god who provided the foundation for all modern sorcery. But within the walls of these archives, the truth was a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and cold madness. The atmosphere of the Grand Library was a suffocating pressure of forbidden knowledge, where the walls were lined with thousands of books that had cost the sanity of everyone who tried to read them. The investigation into the halls of the library revealed the price of Seath's alliance. The traveler moved through the rotating staircases, where the air felt weighted with the presence of the channelers, the six-eyed sorcerers who acted as the dragon's kidnappers. These servants roamed the world to find test subjects for Seath's experiments, bringing them back to the archives to be transformed into the crystalline hollows that now wandered the aisles. The lore hidden in the cells of the lower tower revealed that the gods had turned a blind eye to these atrocities, allowing the dragon to descend into a feverish search for immortality, as long as he continued to bolster the power of the sun. It was a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the Order of Anor Londo was built upon the suffering of the nameless. The undead moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air whistling as they faced the crystal soldiers who guarded the primary elevator. These warriors were no longer human. Their skin had been replaced by the jagged blue glass of the archives, their air one of a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and cold obedience. The struggle for the path to the inner sanctum was a roar of movement, and the rhythmic pulse of the two spirits, the one seeking the soul and the one lost to the magic. Every strike of the steel against the crystal armor was a sharp, glass-shattering sound that filled the air with the sparks and the iron scent of the fresh blood. The atmosphere of the duel was a suffocating pressure of the dragon's insanity that made the breath a shallow and rhythmic gasp of the white steam. The path to the heart of the madness moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air turning into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They reached the balcony overlooking the crystal cave, where the atmosphere felt weighted with the presence of the invisible paths and the heavy silence of the moonlight butterflies. The traveler felt the pulse of the power moving through their mind, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the crystal sorceries that had been birthed from the dragon's obsession. They knew that the secrets of the propaganda were buried under the piles of the research, and the air of the tower was full of the strength of the coming transition. They checked the grip on their weapon in the silence of the evening, the metal clicking with a rhythmic and grounding force as they prepared to face the pale drake in his inner chamber. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was weaving the threads of a new world. They saw the great spires of the cathedral shrinking in the distance, the air there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the crystal garden, and the air of the library grew distant as they prepared for the journey to shatter the primordial crystal. The light of the Lord Vessel was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the madness that the gods had allowed to flourish. The warrior stood at the edge of the crystal path, the sound of the falling snowflakes the only noise in the frozen cavern. They were the ones who would walk into the frost and pull the soul from the dragon. The descent into the crystal cave felt like stepping into a fractured reflection of the world above. The air here was a brittle, freezing vacuum that smelled of ancient ice and the sharp, electric scent of pure sorcery. As the traveler navigated the invisible walkways, revealed only by the rhythmic falling of crystal flakes, the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, crystalline chime of the moonlight butterflies. This cavern was the true sanctuary of Seath, the Scaleless, a place where the rules of nature and the propaganda of the sun had no reach. Here, the dragon had discarded the pretense of being a duke of the realm, surrendering entirely to the rhythmic and cold obsession with the primordial crystal. The history of the primordial crystal is the secret behind Seath's long life. When he betrayed the dragons, he stole this artifact, a pillar of ancient light that granted him a form of immortality to replace the stone scales he never possessed. In the lore of the archives, this crystal represents the ultimate hubris of the Age of Fire, the belief that one could cheat the natural cycle of life and death through the manipulation of the soul. The atmosphere of the cave was a suffocating pressure of absolute isolation, where the jagged blue pillars grew from the floor like the teeth of a frozen beast. The traveler moved with a relentless energy, their boots crunching on the glass-like ground as they approached the heart of the dragon's madness. The encounter with Seath was a clash between the physical world and the ethereal. The dragon moved with a frantic, rhythmic thrashing of his massive tentacles, his breath a white mist that turned the very air into jagged shards of curse-filled glass. The struggle was not just against the beast's strength, but against the aura of the primordial crystal itself, which hummed with a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and cold power. The spirit of the warrior was a steady flame as they realized that the dragon was invincible as long as the crystal remained intact. Every strike of the steel against the dragon's flesh was a hollow sound, a reminder that Seath had transcended the vulnerabilities of the living world through his forbidden research. The moment of the shattering was a roar of light and sound. When the traveler finally broke the primordial crystal, the air in the cave seemed to shatter with it. The dragon let out a rhythmic, agonizing shriek as the false immortality was stripped away, leaving him a vulnerable and desperate creature of the old world. The battle that followed was a fierce dance through the freezing mist, the air whistling as the traveler's blade cut through the pale skin of the traitor. Every drop of the dragon's blood that hit the crystal floor was a thud that shook the foundations of the archives, a rhythmic and sharp finality to the life of the grandfather of sorcery. With the dragon defeated, the traveler stood in the sudden quiet of the cave, the Lord vessel absorbing the fragment of the great soul. The air carried the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp ozone of the fatting magic. The death of Seath was the removal of one of the pillars of the god's old world, a rhythmic and cold transition that brought the traveler one step closer to the kiln. They looked back toward the ivory towers of the archives, seeing them now as a monument to the insanity that the propaganda of the sun had allowed to fester in the heights of the mountain. The path now led back to the darkened streets of Anor Londo, where the shadows were growing longer, and the memory of the light was fading into the purple twilight. The traveler moved with the cold energy of the winter, the metal of their armor clicking against the stone with a grounding force. They had claimed the soul of the scholar, and now the voices of the deep were calling them toward the ruins of the new Londo, where the four kings waited in the abyss. The air of the city was full of the strength of the coming transition, and the spirit of the warrior was focused on the dark water that lay ahead. The story was entering its final movements. The warrior checked the grip on their weapon, the sound a sharp echo in the empty cavern. They turned their back on the blue crystals and the broken dragon, moving toward the elevators that would carry them down from the mountain and into the heart of the world's true darkness. The descent from the heights of the mountain toward the valley of New Londo felt like a plunge into a cold, wet grave. The air changed from the thin, biting chill of the archives to a thick, humid pressure that smelled of stagnant water, rotted wood, and the iron scent of a centuries-old tragedy. The traveler reached the massive stone elevator that lowered them into the dark basin beneath the cliffs, where the ruins of a once great city sat submerged in the black depths. This was the city of the humans, a place that had once rivaled Anor Londo in its beauty and ambition, but now existed only as a hollow shell of masonry and mud. The history of New Londo is the darkest chapter in the lore of the gods' propaganda. During the peak of the Age of Fire, the city was ruled by the four kings, human leaders who were so respected by Lord Gwyn that he granted them a fragment of his own great soul. It was meant to be the crowning achievement of the alliance between gods and men. However, the kings were eventually tempted by the primordial serpent, Koth, who promised them the power of life drain and the strength of the dark. The transition from noble rulers to the heads of the dark wraiths was a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and cold corruption that terrified the lords in the high city above. To contain the spread of the abyss, the gods made a brutal decision that was scrubbed from the public history. They did not send an army to fight the dark wraiths. Instead, they tasked 3 sealers with flooding the entire city, drowning thousands of innocent people to ensure the kings remained trapped in the depths. The atmosphere of the ruins was a suffocating pressure of the collective sorrow of those lost souls, where the air was a shallow and rhythmic gasp of the white mist. The traveler moved along the narrow wooden walkways, the silence broken only by the rhythmic dripping of the water and the sudden, chilling laughter of the ghosts who haunted the stone walls. The investigation into the lore of the sealers led the traveler to the high roof of the chapel, where Ingward, the last of the guardians, stood in his crimson robes. He was the keeper of the key to the seal, his presence a steady vibration of the absolute and cold duty to a world that had forgotten his sacrifice. He explained that the only way to reach the kings was to drain the water, an act that would reveal the skeletal remains of the city's inhabitants. The traveler moved with a relentless energy, turning the massive iron wheel of the floodgates. The sound was a sudden and violent roar as the lake was released, the water rushing out to reveal the Valley of the Drakes and the rotted foundations of the human kingdom. With the water gone, the true horror of New Londo was revealed. The floor of the city was a thick carpet of the dead, their air one of a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and cold neglect. The traveler moved through the dark streets where the Darkwraiths, warriors in skeletal armor, emerged from the shadows to drain the humanity of any who remained. The struggle for the path to the abyss was a roar of movement, and the rhythmic pulse of the steel against the dark magic. Every strike of the blade was a thud that shook the rotted wood of the doors, filling the air with the sparks and the ancient memories of the city's fall. The path to the heart of the dark moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air turning into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They reached the base of the spiral stairs, where the atmosphere felt weighted with the presence of the abyss and the heavy silence of the great gray wolf, Sif. The traveler felt the pulse of the power moving through their mind, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the knowledge that only those who walked the path of Artorias could survive the jump into the void. They checked the grip on their weapon in the silence of the evening, the metal clicking with a rhythmic and grounding force as they prepared to step into the absolute dark. The warrior stood at the edge of the abyss, the sound of their own breath the only noise in the void. They were the ones who would walk into the shadows and pull the soul from the kings. The plunge into the abyss was a sudden and absolute surrender to the weight of the dark. The air did not just feel cold, it felt non-existent, a pressurized vacuum that smelled of nothing but the sharp ozone of the void and the distant, metallic tang of the traveler's own fear. There was no floor, no ceiling, and no horizon, only a vast, rhythmic pulsing of the deep that seemed to vibrate through the marrow of the bone. This was the birthplace of the dark, the place where the laws of the gods and the light of the sun were swallowed by a hunger that had no end. The spirit of the warrior was a single, cold flame in the center of an infinite night, held together only by the ring of the Abysswalker. The history of the four kings within this void was a story of the absolute corruption of the human soul. They were once the pride of New Londo, but here in the dark, they had stretched and twisted into colossal, spectral shapes that drifted through the gloom like deep-sea predators. The propaganda of Anor Londo spoke of them as traitors to the light, but the lore of the abyss suggested they were simply the first to embrace the inevitable end of the fire. The atmosphere of the fight was a suffocating pressure of the extreme scale, where the kings appeared one by one, their movements a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and cold power of life-drain. The struggle for the fragment of the great soul was a roar of movement in a world without sound. The traveler moved with a relentless energy, their blade cutting through the dark matter of the king's bodies as the purple magic of the abyss hummed through the air. Every strike was a thud that echoed into the infinite, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that even in the heart of the dark, the steel of the human world still held its edge. This was a battle against time itself. If the warrior did not strike down each king quickly, the others would rise from the shadows, overwhelming the light with the sheer weight of their collective hunger. The investigation into the nature of the kings revealed the tragedy of their transformation. They were not just monsters. They were the remnants of a leadership that had tried to find a way for humanity to survive the fatting of the sun. By taking the power of the abyss, they had become the very thing the gods feared most, a force that did not need the fire to exist. The atmosphere of the duel was a suffocating pressure of the ancient ambition that made the breath a shallow and rhythmic gasp of the white steam. They stood in the center of the void as the final king dissolved into the dark, their breath a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the abyss. With the souls of the kings claimed, a new presence emerged from the dark. Koth, the primordial serpent, rose from the depths of the void with a rhythmic and heavy movement. His voice was a low growl that carried the scent of the cooling rain and the ancient memories of the pygmy who had found the dark soul at the beginning of time. He spoke of the truth that the gods had spent centuries trying to hide, that the age of fire was a lie, and the age of man was meant to be an age of dark. The traveler felt the pulse of this forbidden history moving through their mind, a sight that turned the propaganda of the high city into a hollow and bitter memory. The story was moving toward the final collection of the Lord's souls. They saw the darkness of the abyss as a beginning rather than an end. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They prepared to leave the void and return to the sunlit world. But the weight of the king's soul in the Lord vessel was a constant reminder that the light was merely a thin veil over the true nature of the world. The warrior checked the grip on their weapon, the metal clicking with a grounding force as they prepared for the journey to the demon ruins. The secrets of the abyss had been claimed, and now the fire of the chaotic core was calling them toward the roots of the world. The air was full of the strength of the coming transition, and the heart of the warrior was a cold flame as they looked toward the light of the surface. The journey shifted from the silent, drowning dark of the abyss to a landscape of screaming heat and liquid stone. The traveler descended past the fair lady's chamber into the demon ruins, where the air was a scorched, heavy pressure that smelled of sulfur, burnt bone, and the sharp ozone of a 1,000-degree furnace. This was the basement of the world, a place where the architecture of the lords had been cracked and melted by the birth of the chaos flame. The sound here was a constant, low vibration of the lava flows, and the rhythmic, heavy thudding of the massive demons that stood guard over the glowing orange lake. The history of the demon ruins is a chronicle of a failed divine intervention. During the fatting of the first flame, the Witch of Izalith attempted to recreate the sun using her own soul. This act of hubris did not bring back the light, but instead birthed a distorted, wild fire that consumed her and her daughters, turning them into the mothers of all demons. The propaganda of the gods painted this as a tragedy of forbidden magic, but the lore hidden in the scorched stone suggested a desperate act of survival by a woman who refused to let her age die. The atmosphere was a suffocating pressure of white heat, where the very stone seemed to breathe with a shallow and rhythmic pulse of the ancient, chaotic core. The traveler moved across the cooling crust of the earth, facing the ceaseless discharge, a towering mass of molten flesh and obsidian. This creature was the youngest son of the witch, a being born in constant agony, whose only relief was the touch of the orange charred ring. The struggle against this giant was a roar of movement, and the rhythmic pulse of the lava waves that crashed against the cliffs. Every strike of the warrior's blade against the demon's limbs was a sharp, hissing sound as the metal met the white-hot blood of the chaos. This was the first gatekeeper of the ruins, a protector of the remains of his sisters, his presence a steady vibration of the absolute and cold grief that fueled the fire of the depths. Descending further into the ruins, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. The traveler found rows of Capra and Taurus demons, creatures that had once terrorized the world above, but now stood as the common soldiers of the chaos. The investigation into the lore of the flames led them to the Firesage demon, the last practitioner of the flame sorcery that existed before the birth of the chaos magic. This was the final link to the old culture of Izalith, a shallow and rhythmic vibration of a civilization that had been replaced by the roar of the demons. The atmosphere of the lower ruins was a chaotic mixture of the blinding orange light and the deep shadows of the petrified roots that made the air feel heavy against the skin. The path to the heart of the chaos moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air turning into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They reached the base of the great shortcut, where the atmosphere felt weighted with the presence of the sunlight maggot and the heavy silence of the lost night, Solaire. The traveler felt the pulse of the power moving through their mind, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the daughters of chaos, who had been split apart by the explosion of the flame. They knew that the secrets of the propaganda were buried in the ash of the old city, and the air of the ruins was full of the strength of the coming transition. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was weaving the threads of a new world. They saw the great fire of the ruins shrinking in the distance of their minds. The air there, a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the lost Izalith, and the air of the ruins grew distant as they prepared for the journey to face the bed of chaos. The light of the Lord Vessel was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the heat that the gods had failed to contain. The warrior checked the grip on their weapon, the metal clicking with a grounding force as they prepared to enter the city of the witches. The heat was a living thing, but the spirit of the traveler was a cold flame. The transition from the ruins into the heart of lost Izalith felt like entering the mouth of a dormant volcano. The air was a heavy, pressurized weight that smelled of scorched earth, ancient wood, and the bitter tang of the sulfur that rose from the boiling lava lakes. This was the city of the witches, a place where the architecture of a lost civilization was being slowly strangled by the massive, glowing white roots of the great swamp. The sound of the city was a constant, low vibration of the molten stone and the rhythmic, hollow echoes of the fire breathers that roamed the flooded plazas. The traveler moved through the arched gateways, where the atmosphere felt weighted with the presence of a tragedy that had changed the very nature of life in Lordran. The history of the Bed of Chaos is the story of a mother's desperate prayer turned into a nightmare. When the Witch of Izalith tried to duplicate the first flame, the result was a parasitic entity that consumed her soul and transformed her daughters into the twisted guardians of a new, chaotic order. In the propaganda of the gods, this was the ultimate heresy, an attempt to usurp the natural order of the sun. But the lore hidden in the roots revealed a civilization that was simply trying to survive the coming dark, only to be swallowed by the very power they sought to control. The atmosphere was a suffocating pressure of the white heat, where the spirit of the warrior was a cold and steady flame amidst the flickering shadows of the old world. The traveler moved with a relentless energy, navigating the crumbling stone bridges where the air whistled with the heat of the lava. They encountered the daughter of chaos, Quilana, a figure of absolute and quiet sorrow who sat amidst the roots, her presence a steady vibration of the ancient memories of the fire. She was the only one who had escaped the transformation, and her plea to the traveler was one of mercy, to end the suffering of her mother and sisters. The struggle for the city was a roar of movement, and the rhythmic pulse of the fire magic that filled the silent spaces of the plaza. Every strike of the steel against the chaotic growths was a thud that shook the foundations of the city, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the age of the witches was finally reaching its end. The investigation into the heart of the bed of chaos led them to the central chamber, where the atmosphere felt weighted with the presence of the source of all demons. The fight was not a duel of blades, but a frantic scramble across the collapsing floor, as the massive wooden arms of the bed swept through the air with a rhythmic and terrifying force. The traveler felt the pulse of the chaos moving through the floor, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the knowledge of the way the fire had distorted the bodies of the gods. They found the strength to pierce the outer shells of the entity, moving toward the core, where a small, fragile creature, the remains of the witch herself, waited in the dark. With the final strike, the bed of chaos dissolved into ash, and the fragment of the Lord's soul was claimed. The air in the chamber grew still, the oppressive heat fatting into a dull, lingering warmth. The death of the witch was the closing of a chapter that had begun at the dawn of the Age of Fire, a rhythmic and cold transition that removed the third pillar of the old world's power. They stood in the quiet of the inner sanctum, their breath a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the ruins. They found the strength to move toward the surface, the air carrying the scent of the mountain pine and the old iron. The path to the final soul moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air turning into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They reached the base of the great hollow, where the atmosphere felt weighted with the presence of the ancient trees and the heavy silence of the underworld. The traveler felt the pulse of the power moving through their mind, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the knowledge that the only thing remaining was the soul of the first of the dead. They checked the grip on their weapon in the silence of the evening, the metal clicking with a rhythmic and grounding force as they prepared to descend into the tomb of the giants. The story was drawing toward its conclusion as the traveler saw the fires of Izalith shrinking in the distance. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the darkness once more, and the air of the ruins grew distant as they prepared for the journey to face Nido. The light of the Lord vessel was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the shadows that led toward the final altar. The final offering was made, and the Lord vessel erupted in a pillar of white-hot light that tore through the stagnant air of the altar. The massive stone doors, sealed for eons, ground open to reveal the path to the kiln of the first flame. The air here was a thin, pressurized weight that smelled of nothing but cold ash and the ghost of a fire that had once warmed the entire world. This was the end of the road, a place where the geography of Lordran simply stopped, replaced by a vast graveyard of white sand and the twisted, blackened remains of the great knights who had followed their king into the heat. The history of the kiln is the final, tragic truth behind the propaganda of the sun. It was here that Lord Gwyn, the god of light, committed the ultimate sacrifice to extend the age of fire. But as the traveler walked through the ashen wasteland, they saw that this was not a place of glory, but a place of desperate, hollowed-out lingering. The atmosphere was a suffocating pressure of the absolute end, where the wind carried no sound except for the rhythmic, metallic clinking of the Black Knights who still roamed the dust. These were the charred husks of Gwyn's elite guard, their spirits bound to the ash, their presence a steady vibration of a duty that had outlived the very gods they served. The traveler moved through the narrow stone paths where the air whistled with a cold, relentless energy. They encountered the knights one last time, the struggle a roar of movement against the backdrop of a dying world. Every strike of the steel was a thud that echoed into the white void, a rhythmic and sharp finality to the martial tradition of Anor Londo. They found the strength to reach the center of the kiln, where the atmosphere felt weighted with the presence of the original spark. There, amidst the gray embers, stood Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder. He was no longer the radiant king of the legends, but a thin, hollowed-out man whose sword burned with a fatting, desperate orange light. The battle for the fate of the world was a chaotic symphony of the steel and the flame. Gwyn moved with a frantic, rhythmic aggression, his leaps and strikes a shallow vibration of the power he had once wielded as a god. The traveler felt the pulse of the dying age in every parry, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the knowledge that the sun was truly gone. This was not a fight against a monster, but a mercy killing for a king who had stayed at his post long after the world had asked him to leave. They stood in the quiet of the embers as the Lord of Cinder finally collapsed into ash, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the heart. The story reached its absolute conclusion as the traveler stood before the first flame. The air was a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic of the choice. They were the masters of their own destiny, standing in a place where the propaganda of the gods no longer had any power. They could choose to link the fire, becoming the next fuel for a dying age, or they could turn and walk away, allowing the dark to finally settle over the land. The metal of their armor clicked against the floor as they made their decision, the sound a grounding force in the heavy silence of the end. The cycle was over. Whether the world was reborn in fire or swallowed by the dark, the journey through the city of the sun and the depths of the earth had reached its final step. The air of the kiln grew distant as the screen faded, leaving only the memory of the light and the steady rhythm of the warrior's heart.